So welcome everyone to the EEAI Conference 2021. We're so excited to be here. Yay! We have Aaron Stump with us. He's going to talk about Indiana's wild climate change. So the description of what he's going to be talking about, our Indiana's Wild Climate Workshop explores our state's place in the climate crisis. We discuss the origins of climate science, the implications for Indiana, and how we can do our part to fight the greatest challenge of our time. Aaron joined the Indiana Wildlife Federation in 2016 as a habitat programs coordinator. Born and raised in Indiana, he received a degree in computer graphics from Purdue and moved to Oregon. While there, his love of nature was rekindled, and after 4 years, he and his wife decided to move back home so he could pursue a degree in environmental science from IU. Aaron has worked with field geologists and as an intern for the Indiana government, but his real passion is working for nonprofit organizations. He loves to spend his free time hiking, snowboarding, camping, and gardening. So hopefully we've got some internet connection issues, so hopefully we can get through this today. We're gonna do the best we can. If you have questions, let me know. I'll be the in-between between you and Aaron. We might have some time for questions afterwards. So Aaron, if you're ready, go for it.
All right, I appreciate the introduction. I always learn a little bit about myself during the long form introduction. Yeah, that's everything you need to know about me. I just want to start off by saying I know that given the last couple years, which man, it's crazy that it's been that long. A lot of people are feeling pretty zoomed out right now. I'm one of them. So I really appreciate you taking the time to attend this, whether you're there in person or there virtually. I promise you, I don't look that much better in person, so you're not missing out on much. I'm going to start off. Now, normally I'm in a room where I can see everybody's face, and I like to ask everybody who, well, by a show of hands, who's actually heard of Indiana Wildlife Federation. I'm just going to assume you haven't. So you probably have heard of the National Wildlife Federation. If I grew up on Ranger Rick magazines, I know a lot of people did. That's National Wildlife Federation. We are their Indiana state affiliate. So they have affiliates, I believe, in all 50 states now, and even some territories as well. So we're the Indiana state affiliate. We do a lot of the same things that they do. They're a much bigger organization, so we kind of do it on a local, smaller scale, but we do work in partnership quite a bit with them. I put our mission statement up here, which I don't have a lot of use for mission statements. They usually just confuse me more than anything. The three things to focus on for what we do are education, advocacy, and action. So education is kind of what I'm doing right now. I put together workshops. The workshop we deliver the most is a certified wildlife habitat workshop, where we try to encourage people to incorporate native plants and wildlife habitat at home or on whatever property they manage. Obviously, we give this one as well. I have a couple others that we give at various points through the year. If you're interested in those, they're on our website. The second thing we do is advocacy. So the picture you see on the bottom of the screen is me back when I had my normal hair. My boss, Emily Wood, and then our National Wildlife Federation representative, NWF flew us all out to Washington, D.C., where we were lobbying. I would say we were lobbying politicians. We were lobbying politicians' aides, trying to get them on board with more conservation spending. And specifically, our goal that time out was trying to fight the invasive carp issue that's decimating our waterways. And then finally, perhaps the most fun part of what we do is action. So this is where we actually try to get out on, we have a certified sustainable trails program where people partner with us to develop sustainable trails. We do activities off of the trails as well, but the trails have really been a big adrenaline shot for this effort to get outside and actually have real impact. So we do native plantings, we do invasive removals. You see in the bottom left, we did a trail resurfacing at Scott Starling Nature Sanctuary, where we helped them put in an ADA trail, an ADA picnic table, expand their parking lots, and we put in some of those native plants and things like that. And then we also have just fun outdoor activities. We do some days where we haven't done them recently because of the pandemic, but we try to get out and just have fun with our membership and explore some of the spaces we're trying to improve. So that's a brief rundown on who we are. If you want more information on that, I'm more than happy to send it out to anybody who's interested. And we'd love to see everybody. We'd love to see all your faces out there on our trails, helping us improve our outdoor spaces. So if you're interested, let me know. I'll get emails and send out some information. Before we get started, I do also want to say that when I put this presentation together, I made I made an assumption. I made one, there was one part where I didn't make an assumption, and one part where I made another assumption. So the thing I'm not assuming is any previous climate science knowledge. You shouldn't have to understand anything beyond the bare bones of climate science to get something from this presentation. I didn't want to assume that anybody was going to have advanced knowledge on that. The one thing I did assume was that everybody agreed to accept the science behind the climate crisis, so that the work being done by our scientists and our researchers and our professors is all based on scientific rigor. And if you're not one of those people, then I'm happy to have that discussion. It'll probably be in an email afterwards. I've done this a few times. It's a massive topic, so there's not really time to address it here, but I am more than happy to talk about that with you. I want to start off with the biggest hurdle that I think a lot of people come up against when we start talking about this presentation. And it's because there's been a lot of misinformation shared, a lot of people with motivations who try to obfuscate things. And that's the difference between weather and climate. So today it's pretty nice outside. I think it's about 50 degrees. It's sunny where I am. It's a beautiful day. It's what, November 12th. Not every November 12th has been like this, right? Plenty of November 12ths have been cold and blustery and snowy. But that's a weather pattern. If this year's November 12th is different than last year's November 12th, that's just a difference in weather. Weather is short term. It can change. It's specific to a time and location. Now, if every November 12th for the last 30 plus years had been 50 degrees and sunny, that would be a climate indicator. So climate is more of a long-term average. And I like to explain things with analogies because that's easy for me to understand. So I like to go with weather is your mood and climate is your personality. So your mood can change rapidly. It can change with very little influence. It can change multiple times throughout the day. Your personality is more like the climate. It's informed by a long period of these moods. You know, if you're cranky one day and happy the next, that's pretty normal. If you're cranky for 30 plus years, that's more of a personality trait, right? So that's just a real quick breakdown of the difference between climate and weather. I also like to, when I was making this presentation, I was fully aware. I was born and raised in Indiana. I've lived here all but 2 years of my life. I know that that creating a presentation about climate science and the climate crisis in Indiana, it's not always going to be free of controversy, but I like to address controversy head on. So I'm going to start off with this next picture. And I want to say this, I don't care how the picture of Al Gore makes you feel, but I bet you if you're 40 years old or older, it probably makes you feel something. You may cringe, you may go, oh, I know that guy. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this is someone who is eminently recognizable when we start talking about climate. Now, it's gotten to the point where if I were talking to a bunch of young people, not that I'm assuming anything here, if I were talking to a bunch of young people, I might put Greta Thunberg's picture up there, right? It's just a face of someone that evokes some kind of emotion about the climate crisis. But I want to try to step away from the emotion that we sometimes feel about this and talk a little bit more about the history behind this and why climate science isn't really controversial at all. Now, I know a lot of presentations, I've seen quite a few, like to dive into the science itself, but I see a lot of eyes glass over when I start talking about the science behind the climate crisis. I'd rather talk a little bit about the history of it because it's something I think doesn't really get addressed as often. And it demonstrates that this is something that we've been working on for a long time. It's something that's well-founded and something we understand pretty well. So in 2006, Al Gore released that big book that became a movie, and I think there was a sequel to it called An Inconvenient Truth. And that really got people fired up. There was a lot of political fervor about the climate crisis that sort of started around this time. But prior to that, there really wasn't a huge political motivator on this. There weren't people taking sides on the climate crisis. We recognized it as a problem that needed solving. And in many cases, we solved it. You look at the hole in the ozone layer that we all saw. We agreed to accept the science, and we took measures to stop it. And that hole is closing up now. So I want to get past this emotion and start talking about where this all came from, where the science behind all this came from. Now, you could technically start in a lot of different places. So in the 1820s, a guy named Joseph Fourier, a really, really famous scientist, talked about radiation and how that affected the temperature of our planet. A few decades later, a guy named John Tyndall investigated radiation and how that interacted with different gases in the atmosphere. And that was kind of where this greenhouse gas term started to come from. But I want to talk about a guy named Svante Arrhenius, because he made a prediction that I found really interesting. So in 1896, he made a prediction that if then current CO2 levels in the atmosphere, which were being caused by the burning of huge amounts of fossil fuels, if those levels doubled, that would cause a worldwide rise in temperature of about 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. And that's a really interesting number that he picked, because it's not that far off from some of the really bad scenarios that we're looking at today. So if you're following the recent summits about combating climate change, you may have seen that there's this big global effort to keep it under 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the issue with that is if every single nation on the planet were to do exactly what it's promising in regards to energy reform, we would probably not be able to stay under 1.8. That would be the absolute best case. Humanity comes together Independence Day style to sort of fight this big threat. We would probably still be at that 1.8 mark at best, which is beyond the 1.5 mark, which is where there's sort of this red line where things start to get significantly worse. So his prediction was pretty severe. And some of our climate models today, we're looking at 4, 6, even 8 degrees Celsius increases, trying to figure out what kind of fallout we could see. In 1958, a guy whose data is probably more famous than his name, Charles David Keeling, started monitoring atmospheric CO2 levels at Mauna Loa. We're going to see this data a little bit later in a video. I know videos don't play super well on Zoom. Hopefully it'll come across okay, but he came up with this data called the Keeling curve, which Al Gore kind of popularized as the hockey stick graph, where he took Keeling's data to show how significantly levels of atmospheric CO2 were spiking at his Mauna Loa observation site. In 1981, and again, because I like to include people who make interesting predictions in this, James Hansen published a study where he said, and I will quote, "Potential effects on climate in the 21st century include the creation of drought-prone regions in North America, a shifting of climatic zones, erosion of the West Antarctic ice sheet with a consequent worldwide rise in sea level, and the opening of the fabled Northwest Passage." So if you're not familiar with the Northwest Passage, it's this sea route through the Arctic Circle that was thought to be the most valuable sea route in the world because of how much it would cut back on route times for trade ships. There were numerous expeditions sent into this fabled passage. There were ships lost trying to find a way through it. And in 1981, James Hansen said, it's all going to melt and be open. His other predictions have also come pretty much true. Drought-prone regions in North America. We have legal battles over water rights out west because droughts are so severe. We have states that are trying to drain other states' water resources because they're literally running out of water. They're taking more water than can be replenished by our environment. A shifting of climatic zones. If you're familiar with USDA growing zones, that's what he's talking about there. These have shifted at least once in my lifetime that I can remember. Erosion of the West Antarctic ice sheet is demonstrated frequently when we're talking about climate change. We don't talk too much about the Midwest. We like to talk about the ice sheets at the North Pole because it's a very dramatic example of what's happening. And a worldwide rise in sea level has been demonstrated already, and there are plenty of predictions about how that's going to play out. But his final prediction about the opening of the Northwest Passage came true in 2007, when for the first time, the Northwest Passage became open to ships without the need for an icebreaker. So you could simply sail through it. And I believe there were even cruise lines that started offering cruises through the Northwest Passage. The last thing I want to talk about on this chart is a pretty big landmark for the crisis that we're talking about, because the Bramble Cay Malomus was declared extinct in 2019. This was a small mammal that lived on Great Barrier Reef islands, and those islands essentially became inundated by sea level rise. There was no longer any available land for them to live on, and the Bramble Cay Malomus went extinct. This is certainly not the first animal that's gone extinct due to the fallout of climate change. This is the first one that was officially declared extinct because of climate change. So that's a pretty big landmark. It won't be the last species, like I said, it's probably not the first, but to have one actually attributed to the climate crisis is pretty significant. Now, I want to play really quickly for you a video. And like I said, I don't know how well this will play over Zoom. It doesn't always play great. So first, there's a lot to look at here. So I just want to go over a couple of quick things so you know what to look at. You see the little map of the world that's being displayed. That's going to show locations where we have monitoring stations for atmospheric CO2. You're going to see more of those over time because we start adding more stations all over the planet. The red one is where Charles David Keeling did his work at Mauna Loa. And then the blue one is at the South Pole. Now, the reason this is called the pump handle graph is because the South Pole fluctuates less seriously than we do at the equator and farther north. So that red dot is going to fluctuate up and down pretty significantly. The blue dot's going to move up, but it's not going to move up quite as erratically. So it kind of looks like a pump handle in an old like a water well or something like that. The line graph on the left is demonstrating the numbers on the far left are the overall parts per million of atmospheric CO2. That's going to be very important. Down in the bottom right, you're going to see this graphed out for you. We'll get to the Keeling curve. We'll go back in time, hundreds of thousands of years, and see data from ice cores and things like that. And then right in the middle is just a little clock that shows you what time of the year it is and the year. And you'll see those fluctuations. They're sort of cyclic. As the year goes by, the changes are more significant during different parts of the year. So I'm going to play this, and we'll talk about it as it goes through. And it might be a little choppy for you. I apologize if that's the case. I hope you can still get something from it.
So far, so good.
Okay, good. So you can see on the right, the red dot sort of moving up and down like a pump handle. But overall, what you want to look at is where that line is, because that line is showing us the parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's growing over time. And then in the bottom right, you're seeing this all sort of graphed out in real time. In 1989, Mauna Loa saw 350 parts per million for the last time. And right now we're into the mid 90s. You can see how many more of these monitoring stations we have. Different monitoring stations, as you can see, have much more significant spiking periods up and down. We get into the early 2000s, and we're approaching right now 380 parts per million. We're still graphing out all of this data. And you can see some of these more northern observation sites spike pretty significantly. I believe this data is going to go to 2017 or so. And once we hit 2017, we're going to jump back in time. So 2017, we hit 406 parts per million. This green data that's coming up on the right, that's the Keeling curve. That's the one that has been sort of popularized when we talk about atmospheric CO2 and climate science. Now we're getting back into ice cores. These are pre-industrial levels. So this is prior to us burning all the coal that we used for industrialization and things like that. These are more what we would expect to see. As we go back into history, what we're going to be looking at here are these cycles, the natural cycles that our planet goes through. You're going to see what we would expect to see if we were going through natural cycles. So you're seeing, by going back hundreds of thousands of years, you're seeing heat waves, you're seeing ice ages, you're seeing essentially what our planet would go through under normal circumstances. And we go all the way back to about 800,000 years ago. So one of the big things that I get asked a lot is, doesn't our planet go through natural cycles? It absolutely does. That's what you're looking at with this blue data. That's a natural cycle. There's quite a few different cycles our planet goes through that impact the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere, but they're fairly easily predictable. We can look back in history and see these. We can predict them moving forward. Where we are now is so far outside of our natural cycles that there's no other way to account for it aside from the fossil fuels that we're burning. And it's pretty simple physics. We know greenhouse gases cause more heat to be trapped on the planet, and we know we are putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What we're seeing is just the result of that. So this is a fantastic video called the pump handle graph. They update it, I think, every year or so. It's one that you can find it on YouTube. They share it on YouTube. It's a collaboration between a lot of different
Pump handle graph?
organizations. It's called the pump,
What?
yeah, the pump handle graph.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to share the link for that at the end as well. Like I said, it gets updated every year. It's got amazing data. And that's all it is. They're just showing you the data they've collected. And it's just one of my favorite graphs to refer to. I just think it's got some great information on it. A little bit more updated in May of 2019, which was the most recent data I had collected when I put this together. CO2 parts per million reached 415. So we were about 10 more ppm above where we were at the end of this graph. I like to keep this mostly about Indiana, but I do think this is a really important graph to look at overall, just so we can understand, because our global issues are going to be affecting Indiana as well. I know we don't often think about hurricanes and wildfires necessarily in Indiana, but as weather becomes more severe, we do think about tornadoes. We have our fair share of tornadoes and things like that. We're really concerned as a water state with droughts and floods, which are becoming more severe. So we're expecting to see a little bit more of that. We'll talk about that later. So while this is global information, it does translate directly to Indiana. And I think that's best demonstrated by this animation that I shamelessly stole from Jeff Dukes at the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, which, by the way, most of this data that we're using comes from this huge, incredible resource that the Purdue Climate Change Research Center put out. It is absolutely massive. I had to parse through quite a bit of it to tease out a little bit of this information, but I can share that link for you as well. You can find it pretty easily with a Google search. But they put together this visual of what we can expect things to feel like. So we like to base a lot of stuff on what we feel, right? If you ever watch the weather in the morning, they'll tell you what the temperature is, but then they'll give you like a heat index. Like, what does it feel like? So that they put together this information, and I think it's really fascinating. It shows you in black outline where Indiana is. And then what we're going to see as we skip ahead is what Indiana is going to feel like under different scenarios. So this first scenario is a 2050 scenario, by 2050. Now in blue, you see moderate emissions, and in red, you see high emissions. So they modeled this based upon how good a job we do throttling back our emissions. So if we do absolutely nothing, if we just stay on course, we end up in the red area. If we do the right thing and we reel in our emissions, we end up in the blue area. So we would expect to see in the 2050s, Indiana would feel like we were more in the Kentucky, Tennessee, we're starting to dip into the South. That's what our summers would feel like. And in those high emission scenarios, we're starting to dip into Texas and Louisiana in terms of our summer temperatures, which is bad enough if you're a person. But if you imagine what our wildlife and what our plant life experience, they aren't adapted. They don't have AC. They can't crank up the AC in the summer. The plant life and the wildlife in those states is dramatically different than what we see here in Indiana in many cases. And then in the winter, essentially what this is showing us is that if you've ever been on the East Coast in the winter, they have a little bit warmer temperatures, and so they have a lot more rain than snow in the winter, but they do hit those freezing points pretty often, and so they end up with a lot of ice. And so they'll fluctuate between rain and ice rather than a steady snow like we would see here in Indiana. And then the second scenario is the 2080s. Now this one is really interesting because if you look at the moderate scenario in the 2080s, it doesn't change a lot, which means if we get our act together, we can slow this process down and we can have a meaningful effect on it. But if we don't, you're talking about central Indiana temperatures more like Corpus Christi would experience. That's pretty significant. I have been to Texas in the summer, and it is deeply unpleasant if you're not prepared for it. And then if you look over there, again, in the winter scenario, not much changes. We would essentially just see warmer temperatures and more rain than snow. So this is more information that I'm going to go through pretty quickly, put out by the Climate Change Research Center. I'm just going to focus on central Indiana because it's the easiest. So we're going to talk a little bit about Marion County. Historically, what they've experienced, what we're experiencing right now, and then the predictions for those two scenarios moving forward. So historically, in Marion, days above 95 degrees, there's been about 4 on average. In the 2020s, we're looking at about 15. So that's a significant increase in days above 95 degrees. You can imagine what that does for wildlife that are trying to stay cool, what it does for public health, for people who need to mow their lawns or something like that, or be outside, people are working outside. Significant increase in risk of heat-related illnesses because of that increase. And then if you look into the 2050s and 2080s, I mean, 30 days a year, 95 degrees plus, that's a pretty significant impact on our wildlife, and it's a very significant impact on our water resources. Frost days, this one is usually one that people are less upset about when I say there's fewer days below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But in terms of our wildlife and our plants, this is still really important. So historically in Marion County, 113 days a year below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's important for plants later on. But what that means for instance, soil erosion is that if we have less of our water resources locked up in snow and ice, more of it's water. And that's not necessarily good when we have plants that are dormant and aren't offering the same soil retention as they would when they were active. It means more of our soils running off into our waters. You know, by the 2050s, if we start having a quarter fewer days as days below freezing, we end up with a lot more water runoff and a lot more soil loss. This is what I was talking about when we had that prediction for the changing in climatic zones. This is the USDA plant hardiness zones, which offers a lot of people who are looking to do native plantings. You know, it's made for people who wanted to farm or do agriculture as well. But if you're looking at native plantings, you also want to start considering hardiness zones, because it tells you long-term what your plant survival rates are going to look like. And the reason I specifically included this slide is because it has impacted our discussion of what is a native plant. So if we plant something whose southernmost growing zone dips into Indiana, is that going to be a native plant in 20 years when it no longer grows naturally in Indiana? It's got us talking about planting for resiliency, planting for climate resiliency. And that's especially important when it comes to stuff like trees. You know, oak trees can't move great distances over a short period of time. So if we have a rapid climate change, our oak trees might not be able to leave or to migrate north fast enough to escape destruction. And so we don't want to plant something that's going to live for 300 years if 100 years from now it's no longer going to be native to this area and it's not going to survive. So we're looking at these different growing zones, trying to figure out, do we want to start planting more southern species throughout Indiana? Because eventually we're going to create an environment that's more receptive to those. They're going to do better. We obviously want the plants that we put in the ground to do as well as possible. So it's challenging our concept a little bit of what native actually means. Rain versus snow, we talked about this a little bit with the freezing temperatures. Snow is very important because it locks water in, it melts it slowly. As the temperatures warm, it allows water to percolate down into our soils. Historically, in central Indiana, we've seen about 22% of the precipitation over our winter months, November to March, fall as snow. We're looking at scenarios where about half of that is going to fall as snow, and the rest will fall as water. That means a lot more flooding issues in the spring with snowmelt. That means a lot more flooding issues throughout the winter because less of that water is being locked up as snow, and it's less of a blanket for the soil, which means we're going to see again more erosion. And then this graph is super boring, but I include it because it's a great visual. You're just looking here at the deepened U shape. Again, you have the two scenarios, the red and the blue. But what I want you to look at is just how the U shape of this graph is getting more pronounced. What that means is essentially that in the summer, we are going to start seeing less rain, and in the winter, we're going to start seeing more rain. This graph is one that people have probably seen quite a bit. This is showing the precipitation increase we've already seen and what we can expect going forward. So we've already seen a pretty significant increase in the amount of water that's coming through our state. And you will probably recall over the past couple decades, we have had 100-year flood events multiple times. They've been enormously destructive. They cause significant losses in agriculture. And this is something that we're expecting to see increasing in frequency. We've already seen it increase a little bit in frequency, but we're expecting to see more of it going forward. So we've talked a little bit about what we're expecting to see in the summer and what we're expecting to see in the winter. What I wanted to do was take this information that Purdue put out there and translate it into what it means for our wildlife. So I broke it down into two different categories: what happens during our hotter summers and what happens during our warmer winters. So if you are at all, I don't know if anybody here is a hunter, or if you're a big fan of deer, you have probably heard quite a bit about tuberculosis, about chronic wasting disease, a lot of deer diseases spreading through our wild population. We have already a significant overcrowding issue with deer in a lot of places across Indiana. When we talk about hotter summers, we talk about more rapidly evaporating water sources for these deer, which actually causes them to congregate more frequently around these smaller sources and come into closer contact with one another. That exacerbates the spread of these diseases that are already moving in. These smaller stagnant water sources are unhealthy to begin with, but the real concern here is causing wildlife, and especially wildlife that aren't normally interacting with one another, but now have to because they're sharing a water resource. The spread of diseases between those animals could be exacerbated. There was a study done on American robins. It was a 30-year-long study, and I love these long-term studies because they show you these sort of long-term effects that we're seeing. Over the course of this 30-year study, they found that American robins were migrating on average about 14 days earlier. They're doing this because our temperatures are getting warmer overall, which means our springs are temperature-wise coming sooner. We're seeing spring arriving sooner. And that influences our plants, that influences our wildlife, their behaviors. And so when our robins feel a temperature change, that's one of the indicators for them to start migrating. And so as they get warmer springs, they take off a little bit sooner. Now that can cause a lot of issues. The big one being that their food sources may not be ready for them if they arrive earlier than they're supposed to. So they need a huge amount of soft-bodied insects to rear their young, to provide a food source for them. And if those food sources aren't established, they're going to be arriving to, a pretty scant buffet, and it's going to impact their ability to continue as a species. Hotter summers also has, if anybody's a gardener, it's got a noticeable effect on our plants. So plants essentially sweat the same way that we do. It's a process called transpiration. They open up some pores, they put water out on their leaves. As that water heats up, it evaporates into a gas, and it takes with it heat. So it takes heat off of the plant, away from the plant, just like when we sweat. But just like us, the plant has to provide the water for that to happen. Now, we can just take an extra bottle of water with us wherever we go. Plants have to draw that water up through the soil in a process that takes quite a bit of time. If they sweat more than they can replenish, they undergo heat stress. So I see this all the time in my coneflowers in the summer. When it gets really hot in the early spring, sometimes I'll see that flower head droop over. Or if you've ever transplanted something and it got hotter than you expected it to, and you see the plant sort of wilt and droop over, that's because the root system is in shock. It's not able to pull up the water that it needs just yet. And that can happen with established plants as well. This is something that they naturally do. It's something they're designed to handle, but they're only designed to handle so much. So if we start talking about those 95+ degree days going from 4 to 20, that's an incredible increase on the amount of stress that these plants are going through, wilting and recovering and wilting and recovering. And there's also an issue with that when it comes to nighttime. So we're not just getting hotter during the day, we're getting hotter at night as well. And if our plants don't have a cooler night to recover, that they remain stressed at night because it's 80 degrees at night, they're going to continue to experience that stress and not have a recovery period. And it's going to lead to a failing plant system. So I told you earlier, we work trying to get our legislators on board with funding, fighting back against invasive carp issues. Um, that's one of the main issues right now that we're experiencing in our waterways is we have this invasive species that comes in and it eats essentially the plant level of the food web in our aquatic systems, and it crashes the entire ecosystem when it takes out that plant layer. Nothing else can really survive in that system, and it causes really bad water quality. That's going to be exacerbated by warmer water. So fish require dissolved oxygen to breathe. Cold water carries more dissolved oxygen. It has a higher capacity to carry dissolved oxygen. So cold water is actually a lot better for fish to breathe in, which is why you see most of our big fish, like our tuna and things like that, living out in the cold, deep ocean, because there's a lot more, believe it or not, there's a lot more oxygen out there. It's a lot better environment for a lot of our larger fish. So warmer water carries less dissolved oxygen, which means it's less friendly environment to fish. It can lead to hypoxic zones where there's not enough oxygen in the water to actually sustain fish. And so when we have these invasive issues crashing our ecosystems, and then the water warms up and can't sustain the ecosystem further, we just end up with this sort of snowball effect of our aquatic ecosystems just being degraded to the point where all we have are these invasive species. And one of the things that warmer water does, and I don't know if anybody goes to our recreational lakes or things like that in the summer, but I hope you're paying attention to the Indiana Department of Environmental Management monitors our lakes for cyanobacteria blooms. They put this out on their website. They'll tell you whether or not a lake is safe to swim in or water ski on. Every year, we have people who go into cyanobacteria infested water. And if you're a person, if you're an adult, you may end up with a rash, you may end up with a headache or an upset stomach. If you're a child, it can be much more severe. And every year we have people who lose their pets because they go swimming in this water and the dogs don't know not to drink the water they're swimming in, and they end up ingesting this cyanobacteria, which when destroyed releases a neurotoxin that's fatal to certain animals. So these blooms are caused or are significantly greater in warmer water. There's a whole process behind it about how nitrogen moves into the water, it stagnates, and then we have a bacteria that breaks down all that nitrogen and removes all the oxygen from the water. And all you end up with are these, it's often called blue-green algae. It looks like someone spilled a can of paint in the water. It's just this sort of green film on top of the water. They're really prevalent in unconnected water sources like watering holes and retention ponds and things like that. And they can be fatal to wildlife. As you can see, this unfortunate fish hasn't survived this environment. So we're looking at more of these cyanobacteria blooms as our water systems warm. This is a picture of a professor from Purdue who is standing in what would normally be a riverbed. And you can see all around him are these mussels that would normally live in that water. They're not capable of moving as quickly as the water recedes when we have a severe drought. And like I said, if you remember some of these years, we had huge floods and huge droughts. 2012 was a particularly bad one. And you see he's got these clams that are littering. This is the Wabash River that were essentially left high and dry as the water receded during this drought. Now, the reason I share this picture is because our mussels and our clams are vastly underappreciated because they're not particularly charismatic wildlife. They're not particularly attractive wildlife, but they're incredibly important wildlife. They are sort of the filtration network for all of our waterways. They are what clean our water as it passes over them. Losing them, which we are in great numbers, losing them is a huge deficit for our water systems. It means that our waters essentially are going to get dirtier without these organisms there to clean it. We also have milder winters, which is putting it mildly, really. These milder winters, again, it's a hard sell. People don't necessarily feel like this is such a bad thing, right? But we have to look at this from a different perspective. This isn't about us being comfortable or our cars not being warm when we got to get in them to go to work. This is about our wildlife and our plant networks trying to survive. So plants are temperature sensitive in a lot of different ways. One of the big ways they are temperature sensitive is in terms of their germination rates. So we have a lot of native plants that require a certain number of days below freezing in order for their seeds to become viable. It's part of how they get ready for spring. They need these freezing days in order to survive. If you've ever taken seeds from a native plant and tried to grow them the next spring, you've maybe scored them with a knife, or you've probably put them in a bag in your refrigerator trying to lower the temperature so that they go through this cold weather process so that they're more successful in the spring. They need this cold weather. We may not feel like we do, but our native plants absolutely do. So milder winters also translates to earlier springs, right? We talked about the robins feeling like spring is arriving earlier, and so they're migrating earlier. There are countless ways in which these earlier springs are affecting our wildlife, but I picked this one example because I really love this little bee. I get to say pretty pink pollen pants. So this is a spring beauty flower and a bee called the spring beauty bee. It's not a coincidence they were named this way. They are two organisms that they don't just like one another, they are completely interdependent upon one another. So if you're familiar with the spring beauty, it shows up very early in the spring. It's one of the first things that shows up, and it's only around for a brief period of time. It doesn't last for all that long. While it's open and available, while its nectar source is available, it is utilized by this bee, by this spring beauty bee. And that's almost all the spring beauty bee uses, because there's not a whole lot else there to get nectar from. This is one of the only flowers available. So this flower is very dependent upon the bee to get pollinated, and the bee is very dependent upon the flower to provide nectar for its young. When you start getting an earlier spring, and I see this almost every year with my native plants, especially if I have irises, and I have irises in my rain garden, I see them pop up early every single time. That if there is more than one day above a certain temperature, my irises wake up and start coming out of the ground. What happens when we have these earlier springs is a lot of plants like our spring beauty start arriving earlier. They start opening up earlier. That doesn't mean necessarily that our bees are ready to utilize them. They may have different triggers that cause them to go out and start looking for nectar. So if we lose that overlap in activity between our flowers and their pollinators, both of those species are going to start being less successful, right? The bee has less food, the flower has less chance to get pollinated. One of the best examples of this, if you want to look it up, is Japanese cherry blossoms. So Japan has a record going back to something like 800 AD of their cherry blossom times, because they're culturally very significant. So they tracked the blooming times for all these cherry blossoms. And it's very uninteresting for a very long time. And then recently, with industrialization, we start seeing those bloom times arriving earlier and earlier and earlier because our temperatures are getting warmer. And then this adorable little fellow really relies upon winter because it's what's called a winter dimorph, which means that it looks different in the winter than it does throughout the rest of the year. So in the winter, it will develop a white coat with temperature triggers, because it assumes, based on where it lives and its evolutionary history, that there's going to be a lot of snow, and it wants to blend in because it needs the snow to hunt. But if we have fewer days that are below 32, if we have, we had 22% of our precipitation was snowfall, now it becomes 11%, half as much snow as we're used to. What happens to these winter hunters who rely on the snow for their success? Do they continue to develop their coats? Do they develop them late? It's going to affect their ability to blend in when they hunt, and it's going to affect their success. And then my boss Emily put this picture in here. She's very excited about that. I don't know. So we have around in the last 10 years or so, we've had about 15 to 20 sightings of armadillo that have actually made it into Indiana. In the past, they've been blocked by roads by rivers, things like that, but also because we don't have a climate that's very good for them. But that's all starting to change. They're starting to find our climate a little bit more acceptable, and might be we might start seeing they're just an example of how we might start seeing more southern species making their way up into our state. And we don't really have any clue what that means for our ecosystems. If we get armored possums moving into our ecosystems, what does that actually mean for us? We don't really know. That's a difficult prediction to make. We also have to think about animals that forage in the winter, or animals that might be migrating on the ground in the winter. If we have more rain and more flooding, does that mean that these animals like these deer would have a hard time foraging? You can forage through snow. You can't forage through water unless we start equipping our deer with snorkels. What happens when they have to travel across these old migratory routes that they've always used, when now they are flooded to the point where they don't feel safe crossing them, or maybe they are unable to cross them? So how is that going to impact the movement of our wildlife and the foraging abilities? We also have to talk about invasive species. It's possible that our freezing winters are a deterrent for invasive species. Maybe these freezing winters they're not used to are what's calling their numbers. What happens if we lose that ability to call their numbers in the winter? Do we end up with a more successful invasive population because they have even fewer obstacles to overcome in this new environment? There's essentially there's no absolutes, but one of the few things that's almost always true is that warmer weather favors the parasite over the host, and that could be the case with something like this emerald ash borer, and that could also be the case with I should have pest in quotation marks here. With our quote unquote pest species like mosquitoes and ticks, we have a bunch of native mosquitoes and ticks that don't tend to bother us all that much. This mosquito is an Asian tiger mosquito, which is not a native one. It is a disease carrier. When we start to see these longer summers and these shorter winters, it extends the breeding period and the activity period for these pest species, which means that we're going to see mosquitoes arriving earlier and mosquitoes remaining later, ticks arriving earlier and remaining later, because they will continue to reproduce and go through their life cycle until essentially the cold stops them from doing it. So we're going to see an increase in pest species, which could mean for us and wildlife an increase in diseases. And of course, this is Indiana. I can't talk about the effects of extreme weather without talking about agriculture a little bit. We are an agricultural state. And this is, while it's not necessarily wildlife related, still very important because it's related to pests. We have about a $1 billion a year agricultural spending on pest control. And if we start having more of these pests earlier, more later, if the conditions are better for them, that spending is just going to increase, and it's going to cost us more as taxpayers, and it's going to cost our farmers more. And if anybody is at all familiar with the situation with ag right now, they don't have more money to spend necessarily. We've had, and this is where you have to go back in your head to 2011. This was a really, really bad year, weather related. We had in 2011, 11 of the 14 weather-related disasters that cost $1 billion in the United States. 11 of the 14 occurred here in the Midwest. We're not talking about coastal cities getting hit by this. You know, we think a lot about coastal cities when we think about climate change, but this is a huge amount of money that we're having to spend on these disasters that are happening in the Midwest. Most of them are either drought or flood related, because that's what we tend to get on a large scale in the Midwest. So thinking about hurricanes and sea level rise is what we usually go to. But this picture that you're looking at, this is our polar bear on a shrinking iceberg, right? This is what we're seeing. This is the fallout we're seeing from the climate crisis, is these weather related disasters costing us a significant amount of money and lives. In 2008, 24 people died to the flooding in Indiana, and we had $8 billion in agricultural losses. That's a difficult number to even process. So these extreme weather events are becoming more common, and they're going to cost us even more money. This is a picture that my boss Emily took in Madison. This is a pretty challenging picture to look at if you look at this floodwater rise. This was back in 2019, and what was incredible about this was that almost the entire state of Indiana was considered a disaster zone. 88 of our 92 counties were considered a disaster zone during this flooding event. The impact here on wildlife and our plant systems is at this scale is essentially the same as it is for us. This is unsurvivable in a lot of situations. There is a pretty incredible effort underway to maybe at least stem the tide of some of this stuff that we're looking at, some of these extreme rain events. At least this is not necessarily addressing drought, but this is an effort to stem the tide on these water events. And that's the CSO deep storage tunnel, the Deep Rock Tunnel. I'm sure everybody who's been downtown in Indiana has heard about this, or at least had your road blocked off by it at some point. It's just an incredible, it's basically a cistern underneath the city, designed to hold overflow water. So if you're not familiar with how Indianapolis handles its water, we have what's called a CSO, a combined sewer overflow. And what that basically means is if we get more than a quarter inch of rainwater, our stormwater empties into our sewer water in the same channels, and then it all discharges into the White River. It's one of the reasons the White River has a horrific reputation for being a dirty river. Every year, we have about 60 combined sewer overflow discharges, and we put about 8 billion gallons of raw sewage into the White River and its tributaries. That is a very, very bad thing. Raw sewage is exactly as bad as you think it is. It's everything you're thinking right now, and it's going directly into our waterways. One of the waterways that's running right through the heart of our city that we use for a lot of recreation. Plenty of people fish in it. And that's unfortunate because that White River is a huge asset to Indiana. And we kind of view it as a big toilet because of the way we dump all of our raw sewage into it. So we have this big project going on, spending about $2 billion over the next 20 years to reduce those 60 discharges to about 4. The issue is we are seeing an accelerating, that graph that we looked at earlier is accelerating upwards. We're seeing more frequent rainfall, heavier rainfall, and building something now that's going to take 20 years. What is it going to do 20 years from now? What's it going to do 50 years from now? Is it going to be enough? So the numbers that we put into it are based upon current conditions, but if we don't rein things in, if we don't get better control over what we're doing, we may see more than those 4 discharges. We may start seeing more raw sewage discharges into the White River. Ideally, it would be none because we don't want to inundate our aquatic wildlife with our raw sewage. So I am distinctly aware that this presentation, because of its very nature, is kind of a downer, right? And I don't want anybody to walk away feeling like, oh, it's all doom and gloom. There's nothing we can do. It's basically all over. Our wildlife is done for. So I wanted to share an analogy because, like I said, I like analogies. I wanted to share an analogy from a guy who was talking at the National Wildlife Conference a couple years ago. And he was talking about, imagine that you are on a plane with all these other people and you're flying along and someone gets up, and if you've ever been on a plane, you've probably looked around, you've seen all over the wings and on the inside of the cabin, there's these tiny little rivets that kind of hold everything together. And so imagine somebody goes along with a hammer and a chisel and is punching out these little rivets on the plane. You got to ask yourself, how many times can you watch them do that before you say, wow, that's enough. You should probably stop doing that because we're all going to be in trouble if you keep doing this. That's sort of like what we're experiencing right now with habitat destruction. So every time we punch one of those rivets out, that's another ecosystem that's gotten destroyed. That's another wetland that we filled in for development. That's another Bramblecay malomus that's gone extinct because of whatever reason. Those are little species and ecosystems and plants that are being eradicated through habitat destruction. Now imagine you're flying in that same plane with this crazy person punching out these rivets, but you're going into this massive storm. That's climate change, right? We're not there yet. most of what we have seen up to now has been through habitat destruction. We haven't actually gotten into the meat and potatoes of this climate change problem, but it's looming. And so we have to take these preventative steps now, so that we don't suffer this exacerbating problem in the future. That means reining in our habitat destruction. We need to have better laws protecting our environment. We need to do our part to plant native plants to support our native species, our native insects and things like that. We need to remove invasive species, so that we can have healthier ecosystems, so that when we do start to get into this climate change issue, we're better prepared for it. Our environments are more robust and able to stand up to these pressures. So our current climate science isn't gloom and doom. It does show us, you saw in that image in the very beginning, if we are responsible, we can slow it down and stop it. It's not going to be perfect, and I don't want to set anyone up with expectations that things are going to be the same, that we can keep everything the same. But we do have the capacity to make a big difference moving forward. So I kind of want to leave everybody with this, the fact that we can address this and we can do something positive about it. Here are just some really simple things that you can do. Planting for resiliency. You know, we talked about planting plants that are going to survive into the future. Planting trees is huge. Trees are fantastic carbon sinks. They draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they hold on to it. And then when they fall over and die and decay, they release it slowly, right? Controlling invasives. On your property, come out with us on one of our invasive removal days. Find a local CISMA, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, a local group that does this kind of stuff, and just do your part to remove a few invasive species. And then I want to say, I leave this one for last because this is hugely important. We have never really been at a point where it was you and I as individuals who are going to be able to stop this thing, right? We've had a lot of the burden put onto us, people saying, you have to use less, shower, take shorter showers, use less water, change your light bulbs out. All those things are great, but the amount of impact that our industry has, it far outweighs what you and I have, what you and I contribute as individuals. So we really need to do this ugly work of contacting legislators and demanding responsible advocacy. One of the things IWF does is we advocate on behalf of all of our membership. So if you don't like your legislator and you don't want to contact them, we do that kind of dirty work on people's behalf. We're a membership organization. If that's the kind of thing you're interested in, you can join us. You can sign up for our newsletter. We notify people when there's important legislation coming so that they can be active. We do letter writing campaigns and things like that. And then I'm going to leave you with this quote from Bruce Stein, who's the guy who made the airplane analogy. He said, the scale of our response must match the scale of our problem. So we have a huge looming problem, which means we need to have a big unified response. And I don't want to put all that on individuals. This is something we all have to come together to face. I hope everybody understands the scale of that. And I hope that if nothing else, maybe this motivated you to be a little bit more involved. It's something that we can definitely positively affect, and we really should. We really need to. This is something very serious, something we need to take very seriously. It's not doom and gloom, but I would like to see us all come together and have a positive impact.